course of your investigation into the young girl's death, was the defendant, John Knight, one of the people who was interviewed?
Yes, he was. His name came up during the investigation. I first interviewed him on March 17, 2007 at the homicide office around 6:30 p.m. I asked him some general pedigree questions and asked him if he knew Dennis Holden. He said yes, and that he had worked for him. I asked him when the first time he had heard or read or seen anything about the disappearance of Teresa Foreman. Mr. Knight said that he had observed in the local video stores and in delis he saw flyers of the missing girl.
Did you ask him about a person by the name of James Rosen?
Yes, I did. He indicated to me that he had worked for James Rosen for Move Right Movers and that he had 3 weeks prior to this interview done a moving job for Rosen.
When did you meet the defendant again?
It was on March 25th around 6:40. I asked him to fill out a consent form for the interview and I would have him starting time, which was 6:44.
Would you tell us what on that form you read to the defendant?
I explained to Mr. Knight when I read the form, meaning his name after that, residing at his address, have been informed that I have the right to remain silent and that anything I say may be used as evidence against me in court. Also, I have the right to talk to a lawyer before answering any questions or have an attorney present at any time. Furthermore, if I can't afford a lawyer, one will be furnished for me free of charge. And I had the right to remain silent until I had the opportunity of consulting with an attorney. After that, I conducted a background interview on Mr. Knight.
Did you ask him what he had to drink or eat that day?
Yes, he told me he had 2 beers in the afternoon. He had breakfast and lunch. I also asked him how much he had slept the night before, and he said about 6 hours. And I asked him about the murder of Teresa Foreman, but he indicated that he didn't have any actual information about the murder. He told me he had a suspect.
Did you ask him anything about why he thought the murder occurred?
He replied that whoever it was probably told by Teresa that he would tell her parents. And he had to shut her up so she wouldn't tell anyone.
Did you ask him any questions concerning the individuals by the name of Dennis Holden and James Rosen?
He told me he had suspected Dennis Holden because when he drinks he acts crazy. He can do something like this.
What time was it that evening when you finished speaking to John Knight?
I was through with Mr. Knight at approximately 9:26 p.m. I asked him to put the time finished in his own hand. I told him I didn't believe he was telling the truth and that I feel he did murder Teresa Foreman.
Can you describe how he appeared?
He appeared normal to me. He didn't complain about anything, nor he didn't refuse to speak to me.
Did he ask you that he wanted to speak to anyone?
No, sir.
Did you speak to Detective Joseph Valencia on that evening?
Yes, I did, and it was approximately 10 p.m. in room 221.
When on the 25th did you meet with the defendant again?
It was around 10:30 p.m. in the interview room 219. Detective Valencia asked me to come into that room. When I went into the room, Detective Valencia told Mr. Knight that he was going to read him his constitutional rights. He then read an official police department rights card.
Let me show you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 1. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do. It's a rights card which contains the Miranda warnings or constitutional rights that were read by Detective Valencia to Mr. Knight on the evening of March 25th, 2007. In fact, it bears my signature and my shield number. I was the last person to sign this card. After that card had been completed, I left the room at about 10:40 p.m. and didn't meet the defendant again that day.
What time of the day on March 26th did you meet with John Knight?
Detective Valencia ordered me a breakfast, so Detective Valencia, the defendant, and I had breakfast together, and I took John on a tour down to the Lynbrook area. I left the homicide office with Detective Sergeant Campbell, Detective Waltman, and myself, and Mr. Knight.
Could you describe what happened as you were traveling down Ocean Avenue towards Merrick Road in the Lynbrook area?
When we got to the vicinity, I asked John Knight, where did you pick up Teresa Foreman on the night of November 10th? He pointed to the right and he said, by the 30 miles per hour sign by the cemetery on Merrick Road. I then asked him, what did you do next? And he directed us to drive to the driveway of the cemetery and pulled up into the cemetery driveway. He laid the blanket on the ground and he says, that's where we killed her. He said they took Teresa's body, put it in the van, then exited the cemetery. He directed us to the wooded area. We walked down the pathway along the fence line until we came to a little clearing, wooded spot. John walked right over to the body was found on December 5th.
Do you recall when you left and returned to police headquarters?
We left about 10:45 a.m., returned back about 12:20 p.m.
Did you leave police headquarters with John Knight to go to the DA's office?
Yes, we went to the district attorney's office with Detective Valencia around 12:30 p.m. We stayed there about an hour. After we're done, Detective Valencia and I brought Mr. Knight back to police headquarters.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Did you have rather extensive conversation with Detective Valencia about your interview with John Knight on March 25th?
I spoke with him approximately for a half hour, 10 till 10:30. I shared notes that I took and explained what happened.
You did ask him if he took any part in the murder of Teresa Foreman, is that right?
I did, and he denied it. I asked him that approximately 3 or 4 times.
During the entire time you were talking to him, did he ever admit involvement in any way in Teresa Foreman's death?
No, he didn't.
Is it fair to say that the only thing he said to you with regard to suspects was that Dennis Holden is crazy? You never know what he does when he's drunk. He could have done it.
That's what he said.
Did you review any memoranda with regard to Dennis Holden within the police department prior to interviewing John Knight?
No. The name came up during the course of conversation among other detectives, including Valencia. I can't recall the exact specifics at the time.
You never had occasion during that time to yell at John Knight, did you?
No, I didn't.
At or about 9:26 on March 25th, when John Knight signed the form for the timeout, did John Knight say to you, "Can I go home now"?
No, he never asked me that.
You have been in the Lynbrook area, around the tracks, the cemetery, hot skates, from December 5th, 2006 through March 2007 on numerous occasions. So you were quite familiar with the locations, isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did anybody make you aware of the fact that Detective Valencia had a statement from John Knight?
Detective Valencia told me. I was handed a copy of the statement. I read it before I went for the ride.
And that's where you go the date of November 10th that you asked questions about? Is that correct?
Yes, my questions to Mr. Knight were taken from having read the statement.
In other words, you were reasonably sure that your first destination was Merrick Road in the vicinity of hot skates, and you knew you were going to be in the cemetery, did you not?
Yes.
I have no further questions.
Please call your next witness.
The people called Detective Joseph Valencia to the stand. Officer Valencia, how long have you been a member of the police department?
Almost 20 years. I've been a detective for the past 10, and I've been working homicide squad for almost 2 years.
Did there ever come a time that you were assigned as the detective to investigate the death of Teresa Foreman?
Yes, on December 5th, 2006, I went to the scene where the body of Teresa Foreman was discovered around 5:30 p.m.
When was the first time that you met John Knight?
It was March 25th, about 10:30. I had a brief discussion with Detective Gerber for about 20 minutes to a half hour. Detective Gerber and I sat down with Mr. Knight. I told him at that time that I was going to give him his rights. At that time I gave him Departmental Form 233. It's a rights card.
Can I have this marked for identification? Do you recognize People's Exhibit 1?
Yes, it has my signature, Mr. Knight's signature, Detective Gerber's signature. I read it on the evening of the 25th. I explained the content of the card to him, and then I asked him if he understood. He said yes. I gave him the card. I had him write yes next to "Do you understand?" I said, "Now that you understand, are you willing to answer questions before talking to a lawyer or having one present?" Again, he said yes. I gave him the card. He signed the card. Yes. I took the card. I signed it. I put my shield, the homicide squad, my command, the date, which was 3/26/07 and 10:30 p.m. at the time. I gave the card back to Mr. Knight. He signed it, dated it. Subsequently, right after that, Detective Gerber signed and dated the card.
You indicated that you wrote down 3/26/07. Was that the date that you read the defendant the card?
No, it was on the 25th. It was the date that the defendant and I signed the card.
But you wrote down the 26th.
Yes, I did.
When did you put your time on the card?
At the time of the signing, when I signed it.
What happened next?
Detective Gerber left the room. I told Mr. Knight that I had spoken to Detective Gerber, and he felt that Mr. Knight was not telling the truth, that he was involved in the murder of Teresa Foreman. I told him I wanted him to tell me the truth. He told me that he was riding with John Rosen in his van. He said they saw the young girl walking, and they stopped the van to talk to her. I showed him a picture of Teresa Foreman. I asked him if that was the girl that night, and he said yes. I asked him to initial and date, which he did. He got to the back of the van. The girl was in the front, and Rosen drove him home, and that was all he remembered.
Let me show you the People's Exhibit number 2. You said you showed him a photograph of Teresa Foreman. What time did Mr. Knight initial the photograph?
I would say around 11 p.m. on the 25th. I put it on March 26th.